Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry. Let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's step. Get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way. We'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country. Vote for Eisenhower.
Last time we learned that Americans liked Ike, so much so that they elect him overwhelmingly in the year 1952 to the presidency. We also learned that Americans also kind of like the maintenance of the New Deal programs. And even though Harry Truman's Fair Deal is vetoed by Congress, the New Deal is still around. Social Security is maintained, and you actually do see expansion in the minimum wage during that time period. But there's one thing that Americans don't like.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
That's right. As General Jack D. Ripper from the movie Dr. Strangelove eloquently explains, there is a second Red Scare in the United States. And we also have to remember that despite how overblown it seems, that there was a lot for Americans to be afraid of. We had evidence of communist infiltration to a limited extent, and there were high-profile treason investigations, especially if you're looking at Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And even the United States vaunted sort of technological superiority over the Soviet Union has been sort of nibbled away by the launching of Sputnik 1, the first unmanned object into orbit. And again, we said that this begins the space race, but sort of behind the goal of putting people into space, putting people on the moon, that kind of thing, that the design of increasingly sophisticated rocketry is not all just about science and not all just about bragging rights. That the thing is that if you can launch an object into orbit, it's actually easier to bring it back down again, and you can also sort of attach nuclear weapons to those rockets. So Americans are very scared. And that Red Scare not only extends to what happens within the United States, but also beyond it. This is a point that I wanted to include in the last lecture, but really didn't have time to do it. So this is kind of like a one-off or a standalone video on some of Eisenhower, or specifically Eisenhower's attempts to stem the expansion of communism abroad. Because remember that we said that Eisenhower is kind of I don't want to say a unique figure in American political history, but he does come from a fairly interesting background. He is a Supreme Allied commander in the Second World War, but he doesn't necessarily believe that conventional armies, like the conventional army that he led in World War II, is necessarily what is necessary during the Cold War. That American security, according to Eisenhower, is going to be maintained with a strong nuclear arsenal, and it's also going to be maintained with effective intelligence gathering and expanding the reach and power of the CIA. Now, Eisenhower privately thinks that Senator Joseph McCarthy is a moron. And in fact, he uses language more colorful than that, I believe. But actually, Eisenhower is afraid of, or does experience something of a Red Scare that's a bit different, and that is the growing spread and popularity of communism abroad, specifically in what we would call the developing world. So one of the developments that we've seen during the early 20th century is that political geography has gotten a whole lot more complicated. If you're trying to learn the names and locations of countries circa the year 1900, well, it's pretty easy. All you've got to do is basically remember all the large European empires, and you're good. The fact is that most of the surface of the world in the lead up to World War I was occupied by some European empire, plus Japan and the United States, and the Ottoman Empire, admittedly. So that is the world circa 1914. This is the world in the year 1960, kind of where we're almost picking up, or at least that's the end of the Eisenhower administration. So one of the things that you should notice is that, for one, there's just a whole lot more countries. And this is partially because that even though the most of the European empires, especially the British and the French, side with the Allies during the Second World War, ultimately Britain and France's empires are enfeebled by just how much blood and treasure that is lost during the Second World War. And so what this means is that almost immediately after World War II ends, you see a series of movements in favor of independence in places like India and Egypt, and really just frankly all over the world. And we also mentioned that during the Greek Civil War, the British Empire sort of had to pick its priorities. Do you try to keep an important part of the empire like Malaysia, or do you spend your resources trying to ensure that Greece doesn't go communist? And so we also mentioned that Britain and France are going to have their work sort of cut out for them. Now, the thing is, though, and we mentioned this as far back as the Treaty of Versailles, that part of the appeal of communism is the fact that communism as an ideology is anti-racist and also anti-imperialist, at least in theory. In practice, as you guys are already well aware, especially if you're looking at the fate of Eastern Europe, it's very, very different. But at least rhetorically, if you listen to what communist leaders actually say, communism is against the idea of racism and imperialism, which means that for groups seeking independence in parts of the world occupied by Britain or France or the Netherlands, etc., that the Soviet Union and communist China, they were both kind of seen as potential supporters in favor of achieving national independence. For Great Britain and for France and some of the other NATO members, a lot of the Cold War is about fighting communism, but it's also about trying to maintain European imperial possessions. And it's sometimes hard to know where one begins and the other ends. So, for example, in the 1950s, you see, just kind of across the board, this push for independence in throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And one of the things that happens is you see the emergence of leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser eventually becomes president of Egypt in the 1950s. And Nasser himself was an army officer who was trained by the British, but after he achieves independence, he adopts this government that embraces something called Arab socialism. And by the way, remember that S word, because socialism is kind of associated with the Soviet Union, and Nasser does receive some Soviet support. So therefore, Nasser would be a Cold War ally of the Soviet Union, right? It's hard to know, because Nasser himself, while he embraces socialist economic policies, he's also very much a nationalist leader. He doesn't believe in, a classless society of the working class and, the unity of all nations, through a shared working class background. Nasser is somebody that believes Egypt should be independent because it's Egypt. He's a traditional nationalist in that respect. And so what happens? I'm going to go back to this map right here. And this is actually kind of maybe a newsworthy topic because we're now all aware of the significance of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal basically connects the Mediterranean and Red Seas together, and the Red Sea sort of empties into the Indian Ocean. It's an incredibly strategic waterway. And so even though Egypt was granted independence in the after World War II, the British still control the canal. So Gamal Abdel Nasser actually uses the Egyptian army to forcibly nationalize the Suez Canal. And the British kind of see this as another Munich moment, right? This is somebody who has acted aggressively, who has attacked British territory, and the only way you can really respond to this is with force. To the credit or discredit of the British, I suppose, I guess you can say they do learn a lesson from Munich, but the question is whether it's the right one. Because the British immediately organize a task force along with the French and the newly formed government of Israel to attack Egyptian forces that are occupying the Suez Canal. Now, militarily, this attack is, by the way, actually carried out, and militarily, the attack is a smashing success. Unfortunately, though, for the British and the French, they don't really tell the United States about it, and they don't get U.S. approval. And so Eisenhower, actually fearing, by the way, that this could escalate further into a confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union kind of backs Egypt, he demands the British and the French back down. Which, by the way, is in itself historically significant, but because usually, before this point in history, usually the demands have been by Britain and France to the United States, because they've always kind of viewed the United States as, as junior, as a pipsqueak, as a Padawan. But now the Cold War and the Second World War has really changed things, because Eisenhower threatens economic retaliation against the British and the French. And so the British and the French and the Israelis, even though they win the battles, they're forced to admit defeat and allow Egypt to maintain the Suez Canal zone. So Eisenhower is canny enough that he realizes that even though the Cold War does overlap with, European imperialism, he's also sophisticated enough to kind of separate those two things out. And he doesn't want the United States to fight wars abroad that are, at least on paper, about suppressing communism, that are really about maintaining Britain and France's colonial possessions. So the Suez Crisis kind of resolves in this public humiliation for Britain and for France, and many historians and even commentators at the time who are looking for sort of a formal end to the British Empire point to the Suez Crisis, where even though Britain demonstrates its military might, it's still so weak that it's forced to basically, kowtow. Adhere to the demands of the United States government. Even more important for the United States is France's war to suppress a nationalist and communist insurrection in Indochina, which includes the nation of Vietnam. So you might remember that Japan liberates the Indochina from France in 1940, but Japan basically just simply replaces France. It still views Indochina as another colony. And so during World War II, the United States Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, it actually worked with leaders of a nationalist resistance organization called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh start fighting Japanese forces pretty effectively, it has to be said. And by the way, Vietnam has always had a reputation for resisting stronger powers. It's maybe one of the only nations that actively and successfully resist the Mongols, the nation or the empire that conquers everything. They failed to conquer Vietnam in the 1200s. You should read up about that, actually. Even though it's not an A-push point, it's actually pretty fascinating. So the same thing kind of happens. The Viet Minh effectively resist the Japanese, and it's not as if when World War II ends and France comes back that the Viet Minh decide to, embrace their French overlords, their returned French overlords. And so conflict in Indochina continues. And so the French are, to a certain extent, they are even more focused than the British in maintaining their overseas empire. I mean, for the British, a lot of their overseas possessions are granted independence without much of a fight. For a case in point would be India, which gets independence very quickly after World War II. But for most of France's territory, most notably Vietnam, Algeria, there's a long and deadly conflicts that are fought to maintain control over those areas. Now, what happens is that the Viet Minh is given support by both the Soviet Union and Communist China in its war against France, but we have to remember that the Viet Minh as an organization kind of precedes Soviet support. In other words, this is one of those movements where there's genuine buy-in among the people. So that being said, France continues to try to maintain control over the country, and then in an effort to crush the Viet Minh, it basically parachutes a large force of French foreign legionaries behind Viet Minh lines at a location called Dien Bien Phu. And what happens is that the Viet Minh use this as an opportunity. They surround Dien Bien Phu, and in almost like a battle of Stalingrad in the jungle, the Viet Minh basically pound the French into submission. And it's considered a humiliation for France because here was a garrison of some of the best French troops who were just humiliated, defeated in a conventional battle. And the way guerrilla warfare typically works is that guerrilla organizations don't usually win the conventional battles, but in the case of the Viet Minh, the Viet Minh beat France in a stand-up battle. And so at that point, the French actually, start talking to the Americans about the idea of the United States coming in and giving military support. There's actually an American carrier group that's stationed pretty close by when the Battle of Dien Bien Phu unfolds, and the French actually request that the United States provide some air support, to maybe supply the garrison or to bomb Viet Minh positions. And what's interesting is that Eisenhower refuses that request. And so eventually what happens is, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail later on, but France surrenders. It's forced to basically admit to the inevitable, and Vietnam is granted independence. But just like we saw in Korea, you also have a split. You have a split between North and South. The southern parts of Vietnam tend to be more heavily influenced by European culture and Roman Catholicism. And so the South is strongly anti-communist. The northern part of the country, which is the location where a lot of Soviet and Chinese aid comes through, that is more strongly communist in orientation. So, in other words, we see the beginnings of another Korean War style situation. But again, even though American intelligence sort of helps the French out a little bit, Eisenhower refuses to commit really any more resources to help the French maintain their colonial empire. It's almost like he was onto something there. So what happens, though, is that the Cold War also, breaks out in Latin America. And for those of you who have been awake at some point in this course, you might know that Latin America is kind of a big deal in U.S. history because of the Monroe Doctrine. And one of the countries that we care, a lot about is the nation of Cuba. So remember that Cuba becomes independent after the Spanish-American War, but basically, if you're looking at who controls the economy of Cuba, it's American business leaders. So the United States has always sort of had strong interest in Cuba. It's what sort of motivated the U.S. to get involved in the Spanish-American War in the first place in order to liberate Cuba from Spain. So that being said, in the midst of all of this, in 1958, one Fidel Castro leads a revolution, a communist revolution, and overthrows the Bautista regime. And so what happens is that now, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States, there is a communist government. Now, that being said, the Soviet Union at first, in reaction to this, they're like, what? They really weren't focused that much on Latin America because remember, arguably, the expansion of communism that we've seen is more passive-aggressive and reactionary. You see an interest in sort of imposing communist regimes in Poland and in areas that the Soviet Union is really concerned over. And the idea that a communist regime could be sustained in Latin America, to the Soviet Union, that just seemed a little silly. That would just be hoping for a little bit too much. But once it happens, the Soviet Union is like, very, very nice. So there's a few other reasons why communism is so appealing in some parts of Latin America more generally. Remember that communism sort of emphasizes the destruction of class-based social hierarchies. The idea is that you basically create a caste system or a class system where there's only one class. It's a classless society. And remember that in Latin America especially, we've talked about how for centuries there's been this legacy of a very strict social class system where basically European-born elites control everything, followed by European or people who were descended from Europeans who were born in the Western Hemisphere, European and, the people who are sort of descended from a mixture of Europeans and Native Americans, and then black slaves. That's kind of the way that hierarchy has always worked. And even though in almost every case that hierarchy has been eliminated on paper, in practice, the legacy of that hierarchical system, kind of continues. So it's kind of surprising, but communism actually, and let's say views that are related to communism, they've become quite popular in America's backyard. The short-term consequences of this only leads to the near destruction of planet Earth, at least from the perspective of the human species. But also it kind of leads to a whole host of efforts by the Soviet Union to encourage the development of communist movements throughout Latin America. And once again, we see that, sort of confusing picture where, to a certain extent, these movements are directly stimulated and nurtured by the Soviet Union, but in other cases, they're homegrown. And of course, you also see a lot of paranoia, not just on the part of local non-communist leaders in Latin America, but by the United States itself. Because, of course, if communist influence expands beyond Europe to Latin America, wouldn't it be pretty nice for the Soviet Union if they could park, bombers and missiles in the Western Hemisphere? So in other words, the stakes is kind of raised there. So what this is going to do, and this is kind of looking ahead a little bit towards the 1960s and 70s, but you see the emergence of several sort of Latin American autocratic leaders and dictators who basically do everything they can to sort of suppress communist groups. But one of the other things that we should remember is that the definition of communist is very flexible, or at least people try to make it flexible. So what if you just call a communist, what if your definition of a communist is just somebody who really doesn't like the regime? Which is sort of what happens in Argentina, where basically the government in Argentina from 1976 to 1983 engages in what's called the Dirty War, in which not only communist groups are suppressed and people imprisoned and tortured, and in many cases just outright killed, but also just general sort of leftist groups as well. In other words, people who don't agree with the regime. And what's important to realize is that Argentina was a Cold War ally. And then we have the case of Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet was a military dictator who becomes president of Chile. And is not only a strong anti-communist, he's also influenced by an American economist known as John Maynard Keynes. Sorry, not John Maynard Keynes. I'm an idiot. Milton Friedman. And the reason, by the way, why I made this Freudian slip is that Milton Friedman is kind of the anti-Maynard Keynes. He in the 1970s and 1980s, he's this sort of super free market capitalist and believes that if there's something wrong with your life or your nation's economy, you need a little bit more capitalism. So the thing with Pinochet is that the American CIA actually helps Pinochet round up and, in many cases, torture communist and leftist dissidents. And this is one of the reasons why America's always had a complicated relationship in Latin America, right? From the Mexican-American War and then on, if not, even before that. But the Cold War complicates that even further. And you're going to see many sort of conflicts like this where the United States clandestinely does what it can to suppress leftist and communist groups. And again, remember that from the American perspective, the two look very, very similar. But probably the biggest case of let's say, a Cold War conflict backfiring horribly is the case of Iran. The ultimate geopolitical will they, won't they question of the 21st century is whether or not Iran will successfully obtain nuclear weapons. And this has been a point of concern for basically every American president since, well, the 1980s, but is also a point of more recent concern. So the reason why that's such a concern is the fact that Iran is governed by a religious theocracy, and it's hard to know how rational that religious theocracy is. If you're interested in this question, by the way, we spend a whole unit in AP Comparative Government going over precisely this point next year. But the question is, if, for example, you're encouraging your followers to go out and martyr themselves, to fight for the country, even if it means their death, well, if you're willing to do that, would you maybe be willing to launch a nuclear weapon and just not care about mutually assured destruction? That's kind of an open question, and there are some different views on this, but that's kind of where we are with Iran today. This is very, very different from the Iran that existed during the Cold War. Iran was a nation that was more or less independent during the early 20th century, but it was still strongly influenced by the British Empire and the Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union. But after World War II, the Iranian government was basically like a secular nationalist government, not unlike Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. In other words, it sort of incorporated certain socialistic ideas, but it wasn't really a communist country. No, certainly not by any stretch of the imagination. Until Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, started to worry about Iran's budget. Iran is a huge country gifted with abundance of natural resources, specifically fossil fuels, and that's something that I think a lot of you probably already know. The problem is that those fossil fuels are actually controlled by BP, based upon a pre-existing contract. And of course, BP is a British company. So from Mossadegh's position, Iran was a poor country, even though it was the source of wealth for a British company. So Mossadegh takes steps to nationalize the oil facilities around Iran. And obviously that sort of upsets the British a little bit. So the British are like, well, what can we do here? Because in some respects, this seems a little bit like the Suez Crisis. Even though this... the Suez Crisis occurs after this. They're functionally similar. You have the emergence of a strong sort of nationalist leader who decides that they're going to try to destroy the legacy of colonialism in their country by annexing or nationalizing something that is still kind of controlled by a European former power, colonial power, in this case, the British Empire. So Mossadegh nationalizes the oil facilities, and then the British government goes and tattles to the United States. Now, the British are sophisticated enough to know that Americans don't really care much for the preservation of the British Empire, but they do care an awful lot about communism and its spread. So the British are like, dash it all, old bean, you know those Iranians took our oil and gas. And the Americans were like, okay, whatever. So, well, they took it because they're communists. Nuke them. Well, actually, not nuke them. Because, actually, that really hurt. What the United States does is that it decides that if the Iranian government is communist, then there needs to be a change in leadership. And so the Central Intelligence Agency launches what is called Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax, for many reasons, moral as well as practical, is not really the finest hour of American intelligence and American espionage. The pitch for Operation Ajax is that a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, Brigadier General Kermit Roosevelt, would travel to Iran with a big briefcase of cash. And then once he got there, he would give that briefcase of cash to whichever Iranian general was most interested in overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh. Well, eventually, Roosevelt finds his guy, and the general, and I think there are actually a few sort of conspirators, they overthrow Mossadegh and purge Iran of communism, which didn't actually really exist in Iran in the first place. At least at this time. So the problem, though, is that you have now sort of made a change in management with nobody in mind to succeed Mossadegh. Mossadegh, as prime minister, was democratically elected. And so this is, by the way, one of those examples of how in the Cold War, sometimes America, in order to fight, to preserve democracy, fights democracy, especially when it doesn't like what that democracy says. So the United States government decides to do the following. It finds an out-of-work former Iranian emperor known as the Shah, who's kind of chilling out in southern Italy, and the United States installs the Shah on the throne. The problem is that this Iranian imperial dynasty lost power beforehand, and kind of for good reasons. So, in other words, the United States is imposing a monarchy on a country that really doesn't want it. And so, in other words, the only thing, in other words, the Shah of Iran is not seen as a legitimate leader. And the only thing that is keeping the Shah on the throne is constant American support and patronage, especially with the CIA basically helping the Shah round up his political prisoners. We'll come back to this, by the way, because obviously Iranians then and now aren't too happy about this. And the fact that the United States plays such a leading role is one of the reasons why Iran and the United States become such adversaries after the overthrow of the Shah. Let's go back a little bit to the Eisenhower administration, because it doesn't seem like the United States is doing too terribly much in the Cold War during Eisenhower's administration. There's a period of détente that we talked about. There's also, kind of during the early part of his administration, Eisenhower sort of wraps up the Korean War, and there's an armistice that's declared. And so from our perspective, it doesn't look like very much is happening. But remember that Eisenhower is a big proponent of using either nuclear deterrence or spies as the primary weapons in the Cold War. Because what he kind of sees is that American society is really starting to change in ways that it hasn't happened before. And this is really just because of the Cold War. And so when Eisenhower leaves office in 1960, after 2 terms, he gives, like Washington and Jackson and a few other presidents, a farewell address. Except that this farewell address is very often quoted by the tinfoil hat-wearing crowd. So Eisenhower actually talks about this growing reliance on what is called the military-industrial complex. In fact, Eisenhower kind of, to a certain extent, coins that term. And of course, in future conflicts, especially when we get into the Vietnam War, that phrase, the military-industrial complex, is used quite a bit. The military-industrial complex, to the extent that it can have an easy-to-understand definition, is simply the idea that as American defense spending has to increase during the Cold War, the armament sector, the part of the economy that's producing weapons, becomes more essential. And Eisenhower sort of makes the point that this is not really good, that it's not healthy for American democracy and democratic values. In other words, he's not really, a lot of people are like, okay, he's talking about Area 51 and some, serious conspiracy theory stuff. No, Eisenhower is simply making the point that it's not really healthy for the United States to have so much of its economy focused on defense. And again, we have to say that this is kind of interesting because Eisenhower, first and foremost, is known as a general, right? Somebody who knows quite a bit about the military-industrial complex. But he makes a point in the speech that the United States has traditionally never had a large armaments industry, especially in peacetime. But again, we've talked about the fact that the Cold War, in many cases, brings about some, incredible changes, that the United States doesn't go back to isolationism, that it still maintains a strong military presence throughout the rest of the world. And this is a point where Eisenhower himself is noting just how historical and groundbreaking this actually is. The thing is that farewell addresses are really significant because they are I told you so's. The reason that we remember Washington's farewell address is not because Americans actually avoid European entanglements or political parties. I mean, we remember Washington's farewell address because Americans embrace political parties and overseas entanglements. And this is Washington saying, by the way, y'all are stupid for doing this. And some Americans point to this as kind of like, well, if we had only listened to Washington, we wouldn't be here. We don't remember Eisenhower's farewell address because Americans are like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. Dude's onto something. Maybe we should sort of avoid the whole, military-industrial complex thing. We remember Eisenhower's farewell address because the military-industrial complex becomes even more significant after Eisenhower leaves office. And this is, in other words, this is sort of a warning that's not heeded. And so, again, this is another example of how even people at the time are aware that the world is changing in unprecedented ways. And that's just if you're looking at national politics. When you open up the hood and actually look at American society in general, like we will next time, you see even more significant changes.